year is 2018. El Chapo has been captured for the third time, charged, extradited, and is currently answering for his crimes before an American jury. Then, something incredibly bizarre happens. El Chapo pleads not guilty. Then he mentions a name that very few have heard, and even less know anything about: El Mayo Zambada. According to El Chapo, El Mayo is the true boss of the Sinaloa cartel. El Mayo was the man pulling the strings from the shadows all along. But El Mayo was also a man who never spent a second in jail in his whole life. So who is this mysterious drug lord? How true are El Chapo's claims? And if he really is that powerful, how has he stayed hidden all his life? Background and early life. A lot about El Mayo's life is shrouded in mystery. The drug lord is so off the grid, so unknown, that he almost became a legend. Some don't even believe he even exists, but he does. El Mayo exists. Those who know him closely say that El Mayo never speaks on phones, never speaks a word in meetings, and has only granted one interview in his life. The interview where this picture was taken. Because unlike El Chapo, who courted fame until he got caught, El Mayo courted the obscurity until he became impossible to catch. El Mayo was born on the 1st of January 1948. His real name is Ishmael Mario Zambada Garcia, and all of his childhood was spent in the heart of Sinaloa, Mexico. We know he was raised a Catholic, and like most of his peers who would later become drug lords, he was born into extreme poverty. El Mayo was so poor that before he became a teenager, he had gone through a host of odd jobs, from cleaning cars to driving trucks. However, the one job that stuck with him through his teens and put food on his table was farming, but it wasn't cattle, chicken, or corn. Ishmael Zambada was a gomero, a term used in Mexico for an opium poppy farmer. Essentially, he grew marijuana and sold it on a small scale. Life moved fast for Zambada, so much so that when he was just 17, he married his girlfriend, Rosario Cardoza. Within a year of their marriage, they had the first of the 7 children they would eventually have together. And as his family grew, so did the crushing weight of his responsibilities. Eventually, a desperate Zambada began to do what anyone with a family to feed would do. He began to look for a means for more money. Early days of the drug trade. The answer to his problems was as clear as day. The year was 1960. Demand for marijuana in the US was greater than the supply, and there were so many opportunities, so many new markets that Zambada would have been a fool to pass on the opportunity. This is how he got into the international drug trade, and a man named Inez Calderon Quintero was his mentor. Quintero took Zambada under his wing and opened his eyes to a wider range of possibilities. You see, marijuana was for the small league players. If Zambada wanted true money, true wealth, the heroin trade was the answer. And soon enough, Zambada learned the ropes enough for him to run his own small drug distribution network. It wasn't a cartel, it was more like a depot, where Zambada trafficked heroin and cocaine into the States. By the year 1970, Zambada had become an established and trusted member of the Mexican drug trade. But there was a problem. As the Mexican drug trade became more lucrative, more violent, resourceful, and organized, players entered the trade. And as a result, Zambada found himself in a very dicey situation. Once again, he needed to find a way out. He needed to either become a big gun himself or explore uncharted territories. And it was at this point that Zambada met his next mentor, a deeply divisive and eccentric man named Antonio Cruz Vasquez. If you have a taste for crime, then words are not enough to explain just how legendary Antonio Cruz Vasquez was. He was a master manipulator, a connoisseur of the drug trade, and a terrible gambler who couldn't be bothered about how much he lost. He once lost so much money that he ran a casino into a debt of $500,000. How that is even possible is anyone's guess. However, at the time Zambada and Vasquez would meet, Vasquez was in a desperate situation himself. He had just gotten out of jail after serving 3 years of a 5-year sentence in Texas. So, in 1973, he took in a relatively inexperienced Zambada, and the latter became a supplier for Vasquez's customers in Los Angeles and Las Vegas. Zambada proved to be good and reliable. So reliable that Vasquez and Zambada became incredibly close. So close that the former ended up marrying Zambada's sister, Modesta. This period of Zambada's growth was necessary because he would learn a few sets of lessons. The first set concerned the drug trade. Under Vasquez, Zambada learned the basics of trade logistics. He learned the necessity of brokering alliances before fostering war. He learned to buy over the police in any territory he operated in. He learned professionalism and how to negotiate loyalty from his associates. The next set of lessons would also be important, but they would only come after the downfall of Vasquez himself, and they were absolutely necessary in earning Zambada the alias of El Mayo. In the mid-1970s, with the US government mounting pressure on Mexico to crack down on drug traders, Vasquez began to fear his family would be murdered in Mexico, so he moved everyone, including El Mayo, to the US. The end of the Vasquez-Zambada alliance. In the US, their business flourished even more than before. At the height of it, they were making tens of millions of dollars a year. Unfortunately, as their money grew, so did the family's appetites. $1 million vacations, flashy cars, lavish parties, and eventually the feds began to turn their attention to them. In 1973, 1978, Vasquez got arrested after being implicated in an $18 million sting operation. His capture led to Zambada's name appearing for the first time ever in an investigation report. This was a costly mistake, and a lesson that Zambada would learn very quickly. From then on, he never indulged in his wealth, and, if he could help it, he tried to ensure everyone around him followed the same principle. In the meantime, Vasquez got a 15-year jail sentence, and Zambada inherited all of his contacts and operations. Now, Zambada had gotten what he always wanted. He was a big gun. But the drug trade is the deep seas, and there is always a bigger fish between the devil and the deep blue sea. In the global drug trade, Zambada was not the biggest fish. Felix Gallardo, aka El Padrino, was the big fish. He was the head of the Guadalajara cartel, and when he saw the efficiency that Zambada applied to his work, he invited him to join the ranks. This was the 1980s, and although Zambada would agree, another drug kingpin was making a name for himself also. He was cold, he was ruthless, and he was brutally efficient. He was Joaquin Arquivaldo Guzman, aka El Chapo. It's unclear whether or not El Chapo and El Mayo Zambada worked together closely, but we do know that they knew each other. They knew each other well enough that when the Guadalajara cartel split up and divided into three factions, El Chapo looked towards El Mayo. Actually, that's not exactly how it happened. The Guadalajara cartel split into the Juarez cartel, the Tijuana cartel, and the Sinaloa cartel. The Sinaloa cartel was initially led by El Pama and El Chapo. However, they controlled territories in central Mexico and found themselves sandwiched between the Tijuana cartel that controlled northwest Mexico and the Juarez cartel that controlled the northeast. Eventually, war broke out, and after several killings on both sides, El Chapo looked to the one man who could pull them out of the situation they were in. You see, El Mayo was different from El Chapo in one particular way. He was a master negotiator who could get what he wanted without violence. All the time spent under Vasquez had fine-tuned this skill. I mean, in the middle of a brewing drug war, El Mayo had managed to work for rival drug cartels while maintaining his own autonomy and independent contracts with Colombian drug networks. He also had done this while staying off the government's radar. People know all the cartels. They know the names. Heck, they even knew El Chapo, but who was El Mayo? Nobody that didn't need to know knew anything. So, El Chapo made the wise decision to partner with El Mayo, and the moment El Mayo agreed to this union, that's when things began to get dangerous for everyone around them, but most importantly for El Mayo himself. From Zambada to El Mayo. The year was 1992. El Mayo was with his family celebrating his son's birthday when all of a sudden they heard a loud boom outside, downstairs. Someone had planted a bomb in the family car, and if not for some last-minute delays, they would have been in that car, dead. This attack was the work of the Tijuana cartel, their attempt on Zambada's life. It's unclear how El Mayo responded to that attack, but everyone knows something shifted in the mob boss from that day forward. Instead of retiring from the cartel and disappearing with his family, El Mayo doubled down on the Sinaloa cartel dealings. He and El Chapo would work together to dominate territories and decimate rival territories. No one knows if the two had an agreement or how closely they worked, but as El Chapo danced in the spotlight, the feds failed to notice that there was another boss in the wings. El Mayo operated from the shadows very efficiently. He was so efficient at holding things down that even after El Chapo was captured twice, nothing changed. It was just business as usual for the Sinaloa cartel. And there's even a rumor that El Mayo might have facilitated El Chapo's two escapes. Meanwhile, as revenge for the attempt on his family's lives, you could only imagine that El Mayo sought the destruction of the Tijuana cartel. This statement might or might not be true, but consider this. The Mexican government cracked down on the Tijuana cartel during the war on drugs, but left the Sinaloa cartel alone. It seemed too convenient, and it was, but who cares? Now this is where things get interesting. When the Mexican government would eventually come to the Sinaloa cartel, they brought down El Chapo, not the Sinaloa cartel, and definitely not El Mayo. In fact, it became an impossible task to even find El Mayo. Even when El Mayo's brother, Jesus the King Zambada, was arrested in 2010 on drug-related charges and started yapping about his mysterious brother to the feds, nothing he said led the authorities any closer to him. 4 years later, when one of his sons, Ishmael Zambada Imperial, was arrested by the Mexican army and was extradited to the US, he was sentenced to 9 years imprisonment. This sentence was clearly too light and proved that Ishmael had offered some sensitive information in exchange for a lighter sentence. Whatever the information was, it did not get the feds any closer to capturing El Mayo. And El Mayo's son has since chosen to stay in the US out of fear of retaliation from the cartel for his betrayal. Decline. I've been up into those mountains, and it's very difficult to capture anybody. El Mayo Zambada is one of the most astute drug traffickers that Mexico has ever spawned. These are the words of former DEA agent Mike Vigil. It is believed that El Mayo camps out in the mountains and hasn't left there in years. It is also believed that age has caught up with him. The rumor is that he is seriously sick with diabetes, and his health is steadily failing, leaving a power gap in the Sinaloa cartel, with El Chapo's sons and Zambada's faction vying for control. The only thing keeping the peace within Mexico at the moment and the Sinaloa cartel together is the fact that El Mayo is still alive. The moment he dies, though, the Sinaloa cartel will most likely splinter, and a full-scale war is almost sure to take place. Now, the burning question everyone is asking is if El Mayo will be captured before he dies. At this rate, it's unlikely, but who knows? Who knows?